You really think that old thing still works? Private Jason's voice cut through the air, sharp and filled with mockery. He crossed his arms, standing a few feet away from the old veteran, Jack Hammer Morrison. The sun beat down on the dusty training grounds, but Jason couldn't resist the urge to poke fun at the elderly man, who was silently setting up a worn-out rifle on the bench. The old man barely flinched, his face like a stone wall, betraying no emotion. Beside him, Corporal Kelly chuckled, throwing in her own taunt. It looks like something your granddad would use to hunt squirrels, not shoot targets. What are you gonna do with that thing? Specialist Brian joined in, shaking his head. That rifle probably can't even hit the broadside of a barn, let alone a target. Jack Morrison didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply picked up the rifle, inspecting it for a moment before glancing up at the distant target. The young soldiers continued to snicker, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Jack's hands, weathered by decades of service, moved with a quiet, practiced grace as he set his sights on the target. He hadn't said a word, not because he had no reply, but because he knew that words meant little. Action, however, spoke volumes. As the soldiers stood there, still smirking and confident in their mockery, Jack steadied the rifle, his eyes narrowing with focus. The silence between them grew, thickening as he adjusted his position. The wind was light, barely stirring the leaves in the distance, but Jack felt it. He had felt it many times before, back in places far from here, places where the stakes were much higher. The veteran's eyes, clouded with years, sharpened as they once had on the battlefield. The rifle, old and worn, felt like an extension of his own body. He could hear the taunts of the soldiers in the back of his mind, but they were already fading. All that mattered was the target now. He exhaled, just like he had countless times before, and squeezed the trigger. In that moment, everything else went silent. The world seemed to pause. The rifle recoiled with a soft thud, and as the sound of the shot echoed across the field, the target at the far end exploded into a cloud of dust and debris. The soldiers' laughter died instantly. Jason's smirk faltered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Kelly's eyes widened, disbelief painted across her face. Brian stood frozen, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with stunned silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was thick with the reality of what had just happened. Jack slowly lowered the rifle, his gaze never leaving the destroyed target. He didn't need to say a word. The rifle, the same one they had mocked, had done all the talking for him. The three soldiers stood there, their confidence shattered, their minds trying to process the impossible. Jack didn't wait for them to speak. Without a word, he turned on his heel and walked away, his back straight, his steps measured. The soldiers remained in place, stunned, their respect for the old man growing in the silence he left behind. The soldiers stood frozen in the dust, the aftermath of Jack's shot still hanging in the air like an electric charge. For a few moments, there was nothing but the faint hum of the wind, the distant sound of birds, and the soft rustle of leaves. Private Jason blinked, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. Corporal Kelly's hand hovered uncertainly over the rifle sling, her earlier bravado evaporating. Specialist Brian's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the target, still smoking from the explosion. He was the first to speak, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. "No way, that thing can't be real." Jack, his face expressionless as always, slowly began to pack his rifle back into its case. The rifle, the same one they had mocked so carelessly, was now treated with reverence, as if it were made of something more than metal and wood. It was a symbol. And Jack wasn't about to let them forget it. The silence stretched, unbroken, as the three soldiers remained motionless. Jason shook his head, finally breaking his gaze from the target. That's impossible. It's just an old gun, it shouldn't have," he trailed off, unsure of what to say next. But Jack didn't need to say a word. His presence, calm and unyielding, had already delivered the message. Slowly, Corporal Kelly let out a breath, looking at her comrades, the realization sinking in. She'd seen what Jack had done, but now, she couldn't ignore the weight of it. You're not just some old guy, are you?" she asked, her voice tentative. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he fastened the strap on his rifle and began walking toward the group of soldiers, his footsteps slow but purposeful. As he reached them, his eye shifted from one face to another, finally resting on Jason, the one who had spoken the loudest. Jason couldn't hold his gaze. He looked down, feeling a mixture of shame and awe. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jack stood in front of them, the sun casting long shadows over the training field. His expression remained stoic, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes, spoke volumes. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his steps deliberate, unhurried. The soldiers watched him go, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. It was as if time had slowed. The cocky soldiers who had once sneered at the old man now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, about respect, about the value of experience. They had underestimated him, badly. The quiet hum of the wind seemed louder now. Jack's figure grew smaller as he walked off, but the impact he had left on the soldiers remained deep and unshakable. They stood there for a long while, each lost in their own thoughts, processing the lesson they had just been taught without a single word spoken. Jack's skill with the rifle was more than just marksmanship, it was a testament to the strength that came from years of hard-fought battles, from a life lived with purpose, from the wisdom that only time could offer. And the soldiers knew, in that quiet moment, that they would never forget what had happened. Jack had not just destroyed a target. He had destroyed their misconceptions, their arrogance, and their ignorance in one shot. They would never see veterans the same way again. The sound of footsteps on the gravel faded as Jack walked away from the group of soldiers. The three of them remained rooted to the spot, their minds still processing what had just happened. The rifle, the old veteran, the explosion of the target, it was all too much to absorb in a single moment. For a while, there was nothing but the quiet rustling of the wind, the far-off hum of engines, and the weight of silence that seemed to stretch between them. Private Jason finally spoke, his voice low, almost as if he were afraid to break the stillness. Who was he asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Corporal Kelly stood still, her arms folded across her chest. She was still struggling to make sense of what she had seen. I don't know, she admitted. But that was something different. That was more than just a lucky shot. Specialist Brian shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on the target that had once seemed so far away, but now felt like something entirely different. It wasn't just luck, he said, his voice carrying a newfound respect. It was experience. It was knowing exactly what you're doing. There was a long pause before Kelly spoke again, her tone quieter this time. I've heard stories, she said, glancing at the other two soldiers. You know, about veterans like him. Legends, really. The kind of men who did things in wars that none of us could even imagine. Jason, still processing, frowned. You're telling me that guy is one of those legends? The kind of guy who's seen combat, who's been through hell and back? Kelly nodded slowly. Yeah, I think he is. And that rifle, the way he handled it. He didn't just use it. He became it. That's what years in the field do to you. Brian's eyes narrowed as he thought back to the moment when the target had exploded. I don't think any of us could have done what he did, not with that rifle, not with all the gear and technology we have today. It's not about the equipment. It's about the person using it. A sense of awe crept into their words as they spoke, the realization that they had just witnessed something beyond their comprehension. The old man had, in one single shot, shattered their perceptions of what a veteran was, and what they could accomplish. Jason looked toward the horizon, his thoughts running wild. So, what now? What do we do with that? We just go back to the barracks like nothing happened. Kelly shook her head. No. We don't just forget. We learn. We take what we saw and we respect it. We respect him. Brian stepped forward, a quiet determination replacing the confusion that had once clouded his face. We owe him that much. Not just because of the shot, but because of what he's been through. The man's a legend for a reason. They all stood there for a few more moments, each one quietly processing their own thoughts. The training grounds, once so familiar and filled with arrogance, now felt different. There was a respect that hung in the air, invisible but undeniable. Jack had left them with more than just a shattered target. He had left them with a lesson about humility, about the power of experience, and about the kind of strength that doesn't show up in a training manual. And, as they walked back toward the barracks, they carried that lesson with them, the weight of it settling in their bones. They would never look at the older veterans the same way again. No one who had been through what Jack had could be dismissed, not even with the slightest smirk. And for the first time, they truly understood why. The days that followed were different. The usual chatter in the barracks felt quieter, as if the laughter that once echoed through the halls had been replaced by a deeper, more thoughtful silence. The soldiers moved about their routines, but there was something in the air, something unspoken that made every conversation feel just a little more genuine. Jason, Kelly, and Brian still didn't talk much about what had happened. But every now and then, they would catch each other's eyes, and without a word, they knew what the other was thinking. It was a silent agreement between them all. Jack Hammer Morrison wasn't just some old man. He wasn't just another veteran to brush off. He was something more. Jason found himself sitting on the edge of his bunk one night, his eyes staring out the window into the dark. The barracks were quiet, and the light from the moon reflected off the worn-out grass outside. He thought back to the day in the training field. He had thought he knew what it meant to be strong. He had thought he understood the limits of what a soldier could do. But Jack had shown him how wrong he was. It wasn't about the latest gear, the fastest rifles, or the most advanced technology. It was about the years. The experience. The quiet strength that came from surviving, from living through battles and wars that most could never fathom. That was what made Jack special. Not the rifle. Not the explosion, but the life that had been lived behind the quiet eyes and the calm exterior. Kelly, too, had been thinking about Jack. She had been around soldiers her whole life. She had seen many men come and go, some younger, some older, some fresh out of training, and others battle-hardened veterans. But none of them had left her with the feeling that Jack had. It wasn't just respect, it was admiration. It was awe. He had shown them something that no drill instructor or training manual ever could, what true strength looked like. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't need to prove anything. It just was. Brian had been lost in his own thoughts, too. He had been the first to notice something different in Jack. While the other soldiers had laughed and joked about the rifle, Brian had seen something else in the way Jack handled it. There was no doubt, no hesitation in his movements. Just a calm, unwavering focus. It was like he knew something they didn't, like he understood the world in a way they could never hope to. And that, more than anything else, had impressed him. Brian had been so sure of himself before, so certain that he understood the way things worked. But Jack had shattered that illusion with one perfect shot. There was no way to deny it. The old man had done something they all thought impossible. Jason, Kelly, and Brian knew that they had been changed by what they had seen. They had learned a lesson that went beyond rifles, beyond targets, beyond anything they could train for. They had learned to respect. Not just the veterans they had always ignored, but the wisdom, the quiet dignity, and the power that came with living a life of purpose. The lesson Jack had taught them wasn't about shooting or war, it was about understanding the value of experience. And as they moved forward in their training, they carried that lesson with them. It wasn't just about being good soldiers. It was about being better people. They no longer saw veterans as relics of the past, forgotten and ignored. They saw them for what they truly were, living monuments to the strength and sacrifice that had shaped the world they lived in. And they understood now that the true power didn't come from the latest weapon or the newest tech. It came from the quiet men who had seen it all and lived to tell the tale. The days passed, but the memory of that moment on the training field lingered in the air, thick and heavy. The soldiers, Jason, Kelly, and Brian, carried it with them, like a silent weight they couldn't shake off. They had learned more than just a tactical lesson that day. They had learned about respect, about the power of experience, and about the quiet strength of veterans who had lived through battles they could never fully understand. Each day, as they went through their training, they saw the world a little differently. They didn't talk about Jack much. It wasn't something that needed words. It had been understood in a single moment. But every time they went to the shooting range, every time they took aim at a target, something inside them shifted. The lessons Jack had unknowingly taught them were now part of who they were. They no longer saw themselves as just soldiers. They saw themselves as part of something bigger, a tradition, a legacy that was built on the backs of men like Jack. On a quiet morning, a week after the incident on the field, they found themselves gathered around a campfire after a long day of drills. The usual banter wasn't there. There were no jokes or teasing. Instead, there was a kind of calm, a shared understanding that hung between them. Jason, who had always been the loudest of the group, broke the silence first. "I keep thinking about him," he said quietly, staring into the flames. "I keep wondering how many times he must have done that. How many times he's seen everything go wrong and still kept going." Kelly nodded, her face somber. "It's hard to imagine. I mean, he's just different. It's like he's lived a whole life before this one. A life that none of us can even imagine." Brian shifted uncomfortably but agreed. "I've been thinking about it too. We were all so quick to laugh at him. I didn't even realize how much I didn't know until that shot." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, each reflecting on the impact of that single moment. Finally, Kelly spoke again. "He showed us something we didn't know we needed to see. That kind of quiet confidence, the way he handled everything, it's like he was teaching us, even though he didn't say a word." Jason looked up at the sky, his voice steady. "Maybe that's the point. You don't always need to say something. Sometimes, your actions speak louder than anything else." Brian's voice was low, almost reverent. I think we were supposed to learn something from him. Something that goes beyond shooting or fighting. It's about being steady. Being calm when everything else is falling apart. It's about being the kind of person who doesn't back down, no matter what." They all fell into quiet thought. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the stillness. The world around them seemed so simple, so easy to understand in that moment. But the lessons they had learned from Jack were not easy ones. They were lessons that would take a lifetime to fully grasp. A short while later, they stood up, their thoughts still lingering in the air. They didn't need to say anything more. What Jack had shown them had already changed them in ways they couldn't fully explain. They were no longer the same people who had laughed at him that day on the training field. They were soldiers now, but they were also students, students of life, students of respect, and students of experience. As they walked back to their barracks, they carried Jack's lesson with them, knowing that it would stay with them, shaping who they were and who they would become. And for the first time, they felt the weight of that lesson, heavy, but steady, like the old rifle in Jack's hands. The week seemed to blend together after that moment by the target. The days on the training field felt different now, like they were carrying an invisible weight. The soldiers, Jason, Kelly, and Brian, were no longer just going through the motions. They had changed, and the change was subtle but undeniable. Their movements were sharper, more deliberate. They paid attention to the details, the small things that had once seemed insignificant. They were no longer the loud, cocky group that had first walked onto the field. They were quieter, more focused. Each day, they came to understand more of what Jack Hammer Morrison had tried to show them. It wasn't something that could be learned in a single lesson. It was something that took time, something that settled into the bones. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, the group found themselves once again gathered around the campfire after a long day of drills. This time, the conversation wasn't about their skills or the latest challenge. Instead, it was about something deeper. Something they hadn't talked about before. Kelly broke the silence, her voice softer than usual. "You know, I keep thinking about how calm he was. I've been in situations where everything feels like it's falling apart, and I panicked. But Jack, she paused, looking at the fire. He didn't panic. He just did it. Jason nodded, his eyes distant. Yeah, it's like he was always in control, even when things were crazy. I don't know how he did it. Maybe it's because he's been through so much. Maybe that's why he's different. Brian, who had been quieter than usual, spoke up. I think it's more than just experience. It's something else. It's like he has a purpose that we don't understand yet. Like he's always known what he's been fighting for. Kelly turned to him, a thoughtful look on her face. I get that. It's not just about fighting, is it? It's about living through everything and still standing. Still being there, even when it gets tough. Jason, who had been lost in thought, finally looked up. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't need to. The way he carries himself, you just know he's seen things. He's been through it all. And yet, he doesn't brag. He doesn't act like he's better than anyone else. That's what makes him different, Brian added quietly. He doesn't have to prove anything to anyone. He just is. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and for a moment, they all just sat there, each reflecting on the conversation. They didn't need to say more. They all understood now that Jack had given them something that went beyond skill or training. He had shown them the value of living with purpose, of facing adversity with calm and quiet strength. As the night stretched on, the soldiers sat in silence, their thoughts swirling. They had learned what it meant to truly respect someone, not just for their actions, but for their ability to remain steady when everything else was uncertain. The fire's glow reflected off their faces, casting long shadows as they sat there, knowing that they would carry Jack's lesson with them always. They might never fully understand everything he had been through, but they knew one thing for sure: they would never look at a veteran the same way again. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were something more. They were students of life, students of strength, students of humility. The weeks continued to pass, and the soldiers began to settle into a new rhythm. Jason, Kelly, and Brian were no longer just performing drills or learning tactics. They were now carrying something with them that could not be measured in push-ups or timed runs. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be taught in any manual, no matter how advanced or comprehensive. They had learned respect, not just for the veterans they had once dismissed, but for the very essence of what it meant to endure, to live through hardship, and to carry on with unwavering purpose. It was a crisp morning when they found themselves in the mess hall, the clatter of trays and chatter of fellow soldiers filling the air. Jason sat at the corner of the table, his mind elsewhere, not quite focused on the food in front of him. He was thinking about Jack again. He had been doing that a lot lately. Jack's presence, his calmness, and his strength had stayed with them all. You all right? Kelly's voice broke through his thoughts. She was sitting across from him, her gaze steady, as if she already knew where his mind had wandered. Yeah, Jason replied, snapping back to the present. Just thinking about what he said. Or, well, what he didn't say. Kelly smiled faintly, her eyes narrowing in understanding. I get it. He doesn't need to speak. It's what he did that speaks louder. Brian, who had been quietly eating, looked up and added, it's not just about what he did. It's about what he represents. He's not just some old soldier. He's a living reminder of everything we should be working toward. Jason nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. They had all felt it. The idea that they weren't just soldiers for today, but that they were part of something bigger, a legacy, a purpose that stretched beyond the immediate and the tactical. Jack had shown them that it wasn't enough to be good at the job. It wasn't enough to be the fastest or the strongest. What truly mattered was the quiet strength that came with experience, the kind that allowed someone to stand firm when everything around them was falling apart. I still don't get how he does it, Jason said, leaning back in his chair. How does someone stay so steady? I mean, how do you do that when you've seen everything he's seen? Kelly thought for a moment, her eyes flicking down to her food before she met Jason's gaze. Maybe it's not about doing it. Maybe it's just about being it. He doesn't try to be steady, he just is. Brian chimed in again, his voice thoughtful. I think it's like muscle memory. After years of being in the fight, after years of pushing through the worst, it just becomes second nature. You don't panic because you know how to handle the pressure. You know how to keep going, even when you're at your breaking point. Jason sat silently for a moment, processing their words. He had been trying to figure out how Jack managed to be so composed, so unshaken. But now, the answer seemed simple. Jack didn't need to prove anything. He had already been tested. And in those tests, he had become something unshakable. I think I'm starting to get it, Jason said finally. It's not about the drills. It's not about being the best at everything. It's about knowing who you are and being able to handle whatever comes your way. Kelly nodded, her expression one of quiet agreement. Exactly. Brian finished his meal and stood up, pushing in his chair. We still have a long way to go. But we're not the same soldiers we were before. And neither are the veterans. They've got something we don't yet. But we're getting there. Jason and Kelly exchanged a glance, both of them understanding what Brian meant. They were changing, slowly but surely. They weren't just learning how to fight anymore. They were learning how to live with purpose, how to stand tall when things got tough. And maybe, just maybe, they were learning how to be the kind of person who didn't need to say a word to be understood. As they stood up and left the mess hall, their thoughts lingered on the lessons they had learned. The lessons that would stay with them long after their time in the military had ended. The lessons that would shape them into something stronger than they ever imagined. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the training field as Jason, Kelly, and Brian lined up for their final drill of the day. The air was cool, the kind of evening breeze that brought with it a sense of calm. But there was something different in the air today. Something unspoken that lingered between them. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. Their minds were sharper, their movements more precise. They were no longer just soldiers, they were soldiers with purpose, with the quiet understanding that had been planted in them by Jack. The drill sergeant's voice cut through the air, snapping them out of their thoughts. All right, let's see what you've got today. We're doing live-fire exercises. Stay focused. Jason stepped forward, the weight of his rifle feeling different in his hands. It wasn't just an object anymore. It had become an extension of him, something he could rely on, just like Jack had relied on his rifle. As the drill began, the soldiers moved with purpose, each shot fired with a level of calm they hadn't known they were capable of before. They weren't rushing to finish. They were taking their time, calculating each move, each shot, with the kind of steady hand that came from confidence and experience. Kelly was the first to finish the course, but she didn't immediately lower her rifle. She stood there for a moment, taking in the stillness of the field, the quiet confidence that had settled over her. It was like she had learned to embrace the moment, to trust herself completely. She glanced over at Jason, who was still in position, his eyes focused on the target. He didn't even seem to notice the passing of time, completely absorbed in what he was doing. Brian, too, had found a rhythm, his shots landing exactly where they needed to. There was no rush, no pressure to perform. They were just doing it, and for the first time, they realized how much they had grown. As the drill ended, the soldiers gathered together, standing side by side in silence. The sergeant walked over, looking them up and down, a quiet nod of approval crossing his face. You did good today, he said, his voice carrying a rare sense of respect. The three of them exchanged glances, a subtle understanding passing between them. They had come a long way from the soldiers who had laughed and mocked. They had found something that no amount of drills or exercises could teach them. They had found the calm within themselves, the ability to remain steady in the face of everything. It was a lesson they had learned the hard way, but it was a lesson that would stay with them forever. As they left the training field that evening, the quiet settled over them once again. They weren't the same soldiers they had been when they first arrived. They had changed, and they knew it. They had learned to respect not just their veterans, but themselves, and the kind of strength it took to keep going, even when the world around them seemed chaotic. They didn't need to speak about it. They all knew that the lessons they had learned, from the drills and from Jack, had changed them in ways they couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was certain, they were ready for whatever came next. The morning air was cooler now, signaling the shift from summer to fall. Jason, Kelly, and Brian stood at attention in the formation, the soft rustling of leaves in the distance the only sound breaking the silence. The past few weeks had been different, everything felt more purposeful, more intentional. The way they moved, the way they approached every task, was no longer filled with the urgency they once had. They had learned something deeper, something beyond just drills and commands. They had learned the power of restraint, the power of quiet strength. The sergeant walked past them, his eye scanning the row of soldiers before stopping in front of them. "You all have made progress," he said, his voice firm but with an underlying respect they hadn't heard from him before. "The way you've been handling yourselves, calm, focused, it's been noticed. Keep this up." Jason felt a sense of pride swell in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had learned not to show too much emotion. It was what Jack had taught him, the strength wasn't in being loud or showing off. It was in being steady, being able to hold your ground without needing to prove anything. Kelly's gaze was steady as the sergeant continued, her thoughts lingering on the same lessons. She had seen the change in herself too. The arrogance that once defined her had slowly faded, replaced by something stronger, confidence rooted in humility. Brian, ever the quiet one, stood tall, his mind calm. He had never spoken much, but now, he felt an unspoken understanding between the three of them. It wasn't about what they said anymore. It was about the way they carried themselves, the way they moved with purpose and grace. After the formation ended, they found themselves standing together again, as they often did after drills. There was no need for words at first. They didn't need to talk about how they had changed, how the way they saw the world had shifted. It was clear to all of them. "I think we've finally gotten it," Jason said, breaking the silence. Kelly looked at him and smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think we have." Brian nodded. "It's not just about being good soldiers anymore. It's about being good people. People who can handle what comes at them without losing themselves." Jason looked out across the field, a sense of peace settling over him. They had learned something that couldn't be taught in a classroom. It was a lesson about strength, but also about patience. About knowing when to act and when to remain still. They had learned to be like Jack, to stand firm, not because they had to, but because they knew they could. The rest of the day went by without much thought. They trained, they moved through the drills with ease, but something was different. There was a quiet undercurrent to everything they did now. They weren't rushing to finish or to be the best. They were simply moving through the motions, knowing that they had already reached a level of understanding that many soldiers never would. As the sun began to set that evening, casting long shadows across the base, Jason felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known before. They were ready. Not just for the next drill, but for whatever lay ahead. They had faced their own doubts, their own arrogance, and come out the other side stronger. They weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. They were steady now, and that was enough.